So in the previous video, we saw how to factor using the traditional method. Again, that was a video that was not done by me, but done by someone else, and you can see that on Moodle. But that's the way I was taught how to factor, and I never appreciated factoring, never really got into it. I always got frustrated, I always wanted to give up, just because it was very tedious, very time-consuming, and I'd oftentimes get lost. So I was very happy to discover this method, and this method I call the Xbox method. It makes it a little less stressful, makes it more into almost a game sometimes of trying to find numbers that work out. But you'll see that it's a lot more enjoyable than the traditional method. And if you have not watched that method, please do so you can appreciate this method all the more. Okay, so let's say if we have a situation like this, x squared plus 4x minus 12. We use this Xbox method anytime we have three terms. And the way we set this up is we start by drawing an X and a box. And the box is going to be a 2x2 grid. Now when we go, after we get this X and box created, we're going to put an X, whatever the first term is, in the top left corner. So an X squared, whatever the last term is, now that's a minus 12. I'm going to put that in the bottom right hand corner. Now let's move over to our X. So in the X, what we're going to do is we're going to take and multiply the outer terms, the x squared and negative 12, put that in the top part of the box. So that's going to be negative 12x squared. And we're going to take that middle term and put that in the bottom part of our X. So now we have everything set up. So now what we're going to do is we're going to try to figure out two numbers that multiply together to give us negative 12x squared, the same two numbers that add together to be 4x. So what you do is you have to think of the factors of 12, like for example 1 and 12. But if you notice, when we add them together it's got to be a positive, and when we multiply them together it's going to be a negative. So what that implies is that one of the numbers has to be negative, and the fact that when we add them together it's positive means the larger of the two numbers is going to be negative. I'm sorry, it's going to be positive. So between 12x squared and 1, I would have a 12x squared and a negative 1. Well, those multiply to be negative 12x squared, but they don't add together to be 4x. So maybe you've already thought of it, but your answer would be 6x and a negative 2x. Because when you multiply those, you get negative 12x squared. And when you add them together, you get 4x. So we put those two terms over here and fill in the rest of our box. Now it does not matter where I put the 6x and the negative 2x. I could have swapped these two and our answer would end up being the same. But just so that we're being consistent, why don't you put the 6x in the top right corner for right now and the negative 2x in the bottom left corner. Now the next step is going to be to find what's called the greatest common factor. And we're going to look for that for each row, and then we're going to look for the greatest common factor in each column. A greatest common factor is the largest number that would largest number that would divide evenly into both of the terms. Now, both these terms have an x, so I'm going to factor out an x, but the coefficient here for the x squared would be a 1, so between the 1 and the 6, the greatest common factor is just 1, so we'll just leave that as just an x for right now. Let's look at this next row. Next row, the greatest common factor here between negative 2x and negative 12 would be a negative 2. Now the reason why it's going to be negative is only because this first term is negative. If that first term in the box is a negative, we always take out a negative. If the first term is positive, we take out a positive number. So it's only if this first one's negative that we take out a negative. Now let's look at this column. In this column, we have an x squared and a negative 2x, so we're going to take out an x. In the next column, we would take out a positive 6. Now here's how we could check your answers. If I multiply these, I'm going to multiply what's outside the boxes to make sure I get what's inside the box. X times x is x squared. X times 6 is 6x. Negative 2 times x is negative 2x. Negative 2 times 6 is negative 12. And sure enough, if I add together the like terms, 6x and negative 2x, you get 4x, which is what our original problem was. So now I can verify that I have the right answer. So my answer is what's outside the box. Now if you leave it like this, that's just showing your work. That's not writing down your answer. You want to make sure that you write down your answer as x plus 6 times x minus 2. Now, you can put these factors in any order. You could have had x minus 2 and x plus 6. It wouldn't matter. but this would be your final answer. Let's try another one. Now, doing a problem like this with the traditional method would be tricky, but with the Xbox method, it's a lot easier. So again, we start out by putting the first term in this box, put the last term down here. Multiply those two outer terms together. 3x squared times 4 is 12x squared. Write down the middle term in the bottom part of the x. And now where's the fun? Now this is where the fun begins. We're trying to figure out two numbers that multiply together to be a positive 12. Same two numbers add together to be a negative 8. Now that implies if they're multiplying together to be positive, but when we add them together they're negative, the only way that happens is if both our numbers are negative. So now, can you think of two numbers that multiply together to be 12 and same two numbers add together to be negative 8? Well, should have came up with negative 2x and a negative 6x. So we're going to factor out here in the first row, we factor out an x. In the second row, we're going to factor out a negative 2. In the first column, we're going to factor out a 3x. They both have a 3 that divides evenly into 3 and negative 6. And they both have an x in common. In the second row, or second column, we're going to factor out a negative 2. Again, make sure that this works out. X times x is 3x squared. X times negative 2 is negative 2x. Negative 2 times 3x is negative 6x. Negative 2 times negative 2 is a positive 4. So our answer would be x minus 2 times 3x minus 2. Why don't you guys try this last one on your own? So why don't you pause the video and hit play when you're ready to check to see that you have your answer right. Okay, let's see what you did here. You should have had 6x squared and a negative 10. And over here, this would be a negative 60x squared and a negative 17x. And the next step, we're going to try to figure out what two numbers that multiply together to be negative 60. Same two numbers add together to be negative 17. So let's see, you would have had a negative 20x and a positive 3x. And now let's look for the greatest common factor. So in this row here, this would be a 2x. And this row here, now if you ever have a situation like this, between the 3 and the negative 10, there's nothing in common. But every number has a factor of 1. So worst case scenario, you can always factor out a 1. Maybe you got that, maybe you didn't. But in this column, then you'd factor out a 3x. And in this one, it would be a negative 10. Check your answer. 2x times 3x is 6x squared, negative 20x, 3x, and negative 10. So your answer is 3x minus 10 times 2x plus 1. And if you notice, this problem that we just did is the same problem that was shown in that video using the traditional method. And you can see that doing it this way was a heck of a lot faster. So this is how you do factoring trinomials when there are 3 terms. This is kind of the meat and potatoes, the main idea. There are other things to look for first, like a greatest common factor before you get started. I didn't talk about that, but we'll talk about that in the next video. I just wanted to make sure you understand the key concept here of how to factor. So with that, good luck on your assignment.